There are places in this world that even before you know the horrific details of what transpired inside their walls, already carry the heavy, unmistakable scent of death. A lingering darkness that seems to seep into the very wood and concrete. It is August 13th, 2018. The early afternoon sun is beating down on the quiet, picture-perfect suburban streets of Frederick, Colorado. This is the kind of neighborhood where people move to escape the chaos of the city. A place of manicured lawns, large two-car garages, and friendly neighbors who wave to each other on their morning jogs. But today, the pristine facade of this American dream is about to crack, revealing a nightmare so profound it will shock the entire nation to its core. A police officer named Coonrod steps out of his patrol vehicle. The sound of his heavy boots hitting the pavement echoes slightly in the warm afternoon air. He approaches the large, seemingly peaceful home located at 2825 Saratoga Trail. The house looks entirely normal from the outside. There are no shattered windows. There are no signs of a forced entry. There are no bloodstains on the perfectly green grass. And most chillingly of all, there are no screams. Officer Coonrod raises his hand and knocks on the heavy wooden front door. He steps back, waiting for the familiar sound of footsteps approaching from the inside. He waits for a mother carrying a toddler, or a smiling husband to greet him. But there is nothing. The silence that answers from the other side of that door is absolute. It is the specific, suffocating type of silence that immediately chills the blood of veteran investigators. The only sign of life coming from the property is the frantic, muffled barking of a small dog, trapped somewhere deep in the darkness of the empty house. The dog sounds panicked, scratching at the floors, as if it is desperately trying to warn the officer about the foul, corrupted air it is breathing inside. What Officer Coonrod and the rest of the world are about to discover when they finally cross that threshold is not just a standard crime scene. It is a terrifying descent into the darkest, most inexplicable, and cruelest corners of the human psyche. When that front door eventually swings open, the comfortable illusion of the perfect American family will be permanently shattered. We are about to walk, step by step, into a void where 4 lives were completely erased without a single trace. And the true barbarity, the absolute, unfiltered evil, is hiding in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered in the long shadows of the Saratoga Trail. This is the true story of a monster who wore the mask of a loving father, and it begins with a knock on a door that nobody will ever answer. To truly understand the profound depths of the darkness that swallowed the house located at 2825 Saratoga Trail, we must first look directly into the bright light that this exact same darkness devoured. The city of Frederick, nestled at the foothills of the majestic Rocky Mountains in the state of Colorado, is the perfect archetype of the upper-middle-class American suburb. Incredibly peaceful streets, meticulously cut and watered green lawns, and neighbors who cordially wave to each other from the sidewalks on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It is the golden, silent refuge for upwardly mobile families fleeing the unpredictable violence and chaos of the major metropolitan cities. And standing right at the exact center of this illusion of flawless security lived the family that best represented this unattainable American dream of success. The Watts family. At 34 years of age, Shanann Watts was, in every possible sense of the word, an unstoppable force of nature. Her personal journey to acquiring that imposing, beautiful home had not been easy by any stretch of the imagination. A few years prior, she had received a completely devastating medical diagnosis. She suffered from lupus, an invisible and highly cruel autoimmune disease that caused terrible chronic pain, literally attacking her own body from the inside out. The doctors had even stated, quite categorically, that the disease would likely steal the greatest dream of her entire life: the dream of becoming a mother. But Shanann was a fiercely stubborn survivor. She fought through the excruciating pain, completely defied all the medical statistics, and successfully gave birth to two beautiful, energetic, and perfectly healthy little girls: Bella Marie Watts, who was 4 years of age, and Celeste Catherine, affectionately nicknamed Cece, who was 3 years of age. And, as if this double miracle was not enough, she was now carrying a third baby in her womb. A little boy at just 15 weeks of gestation, who already had a name chosen with an abundance of love. He was going to be called Nico. To the outside world, and to her thousands of followers, Shanann's life was an authentic, real-time showcase of absolute perfection. Working as a direct sales executive for a health and wellness supplement company, her job fundamentally required her to be the living embodiment of boundless energy and success. She broadcasted her daily routine almost every single day through live video recordings on the Facebook platform. Through the glowing glass screens of our cell phones, she exhibited a family life that appeared to be perfectly choreographed. She smiled with perfectly aligned teeth. Her daughters ran happily and safely through the spacious, well-decorated living room, and her husband, Christopher Lee Watts, frequently appeared lingering in the background. Chris, who worked as an operator in petroleum extraction refineries, was a quiet, homebody type of man, and in the videos, he always appeared seemingly submissive to his wife's every desire. Shanann would frequently look directly into the camera lens and declare to her audience that Chris was the absolute best thing that had ever happened to her, the incredibly patient safe harbor who loved and supported her through her absolute worst and most painful moments of health. The entire world watched and believed, without the slightest shadow of a doubt, that he was the most perfect father and husband anyone could possibly ask for. But, as it happens so many times in the dark history of the most brutal crimes, social media forms the thickest and most perfect hiding place to conceal absolute chaos. Behind those perfectly painted walls on Saratoga Trail, the invisible foundation of the Watts family was crumbling and rotting at an alarming speed. That so-called American dream was financially suffocating them. In the year 2015, they had been forced to file for official bankruptcy in the court system. Heavy credit card debts were growing frighteningly fast, like an avalanche, and the mandatory luxury homeowners association fees were severely past due. The financial stress was a constant boiling pressure cooker. However, the lack of money was merely the most superficial symptom of a much darker, far more lethal disease that had permanently infected the core of that marriage. During that fateful summer of the year 2018, the thin mask of the submissive husband began to aggressively melt away. During a long 5-week trip where Shanann took the girls to visit family in North Carolina, Chris's behavior drastically changed. Isolated and completely free back in the state of Colorado, he began living a double life, initiating an intense extramarital affair with a female co-worker. When he finally traveled to meet his wife and daughters, Shanann immediately noticed the massive psychological abyss that now separated them. She began frantically sending dozens of anguished text messages to her close friends. She typed with trembling fingers on her cell phone keyboard that her husband completely refused to hug her, that he would not touch her, and that his gaze was empty, distant, and terrifyingly cold. She was pregnant, physically ill, and feeling the ground completely collapse beneath her feet. The great, horrific tragedy is that Shanann genuinely believed the greatest danger she was facing was a simple, bureaucratic request for a divorce. She had absolutely no idea that the dark, twisted mind of her partner was not just planning a legal separation. He was actively planning the total annihilation and absolute physical elimination of his entire family. Which brings us right back to the starting point of our criminal investigation. That dark, suffocating Monday morning, August 13th, 2018. The clock was advancing with the precision of a sharp razor blade. It was just a few hours before the sun would attempt to rise. Shanann was returning from an exhausting business trip in the city of Scottsdale in the state of Arizona. Her commercial flight had suffered a long, frustrating delay of several hours due to intense thunderstorms. She was experiencing the extreme absolute limit of her physical exhaustion. Her diseased joints were fiercely throbbing, and the weight of the growing baby pulled her energy violently downward. The only thing she desired in that exact moment was to simply close her eyes and sink into the peaceful comfort of her own pillow. Her friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, carefully drives her car through the dark, silent streets of Frederick. The city now looks like a true ghost town. There is absolutely not a single living soul in sight. Not a single light shining in any of the windows. Nicole parks the vehicle, keeping the engine running, right in front of the concrete driveway of the Watts home. The bright digital clock on the car's dashboard reads exactly 1:48 in the morning. This exact time will remain permanently carved and frozen in the timeline of this atrocity forever. It is the last final breath of normalcy. Shanann softly says goodbye to her friend, opens the heavy door, and steps out of the passenger seat. The security camera lens embedded in the doorbell, an electronic eye that records in the pitch black dark, is instantly activated. The ghostly video that remains from that fateful night shows Shanann facing away from the street. She drags her heavy rolling suitcase up the concrete sidewalk. The dry, rhythmic sound of hard plastic scraping against the asphalt echoes in complete isolation through the freezing morning air. She approaches the tall, dark front door. With a mechanical gesture born of pure exhaustion, she raises her hand and types her security passcode into the electronic lock. The device emits a short, high-pitched beep. The security light changes to a glowing green color. The handle unlocks with a heavy metallic click. Shanann pushes the thick wooden door open, revealing, for just a brief second, the deep, silent, black vastness of her home's interior hallway. She takes the last, fatal step of her entire life, dragging her luggage into the dark hall. Seconds later, the door closes behind her back with the definitive, final click of the latch. The silence completely swallows the street. That exact moment when the door shuts is the instant when the heart of any investigator simply freezes inside their chest, because we, who are now watching the tape from the outside of the house, know with a terrifying, depressing clarity exactly what is waiting for her inside. Hidden in that absolute pitch-black darkness under the roof of that $400,000 home. The caring husband from the Facebook videos is not resting peacefully in his bed. Christopher Lee Watts is wide awake. His eyes are wide open, fully adjusted to the dark. The man who had promised at the altar to be the greatest shield and protector of that family had slowly transformed under the cover of night into a cold-blooded hunter inside his own cave. While the reinforced door keeps them locked away from the eyes of the outside world, and the surrounding neighbors continue to sleep the sleep of the righteous, the air inside becomes fatal. In the dense, agonizing 3 hours that followed the shutting of that door, while the darkness muffled any desperate attempt at a scream, the hopeful lungs of Shanann, the small lungs of Bella, the frightened gasps of Celeste, and the tiny, beating heart of Nico were all asphyxiated and violently erased from the face of the earth by their own creator. It becomes horrifyingly clear that the scariest monster is not the distorted shadow on the wall of a child's bedroom. The most lethal monster sometimes lays its head on the pillow right next to yours. And when the morning of August 13th finally broke over the state of Colorado, that address, once filled with laughter, was sepulchrally empty. Pure evil with a freshly washed face was just beginning its show. When the sun finally began to rise over the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains on the morning of Monday, August 13th, 2018, the quiet neighborhood of Saratoga Trail looked exactly as it always did. The golden morning light spilled across the perfectly manicured green lawns. Sprinklers hissed to life in a rhythmic, peaceful cycle. But inside the walls of number 2825, the silence was heavy, corrupted, and absolute. The vibrant, chaotic energy of a home usually filled with a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old girl was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the cold, mechanical movements of a murderer attempting to erase his own family from existence. At approximately 5:15 in the morning, while the rest of the street was still deep in sleep, Christopher Lee Watts was awake. He was not mourning. He was not panicking. Operating with a chilling, sociopathic calmness, he backed his white Ford work truck out of the street and straight into the narrow driveway, stopping just short of his garage doors. This was a highly unusual maneuver. He never parked there. Over the next 45 minutes, under the cover of the pre-dawn darkness, he loaded the lifeless bodies of his pregnant wife, Shanann, and his 2 little girls, Bella and Celeste, into the back of his truck. He placed a red gas can alongside them. He locked the front door of his home, climbed into the driver's seat, and drove away to the remote Anadarko petroleum site known as Shervey 319. As the engine of his truck faded into the distance, Chris Watts genuinely believed he had committed the perfect crime. He believed he had bought himself days, perhaps even weeks, to fabricate a story about his wife running away to clear her head. He believed he was smarter than the system. But Chris Watts made one massive, fatal miscalculation. He severely underestimated the power of female intuition, and he completely misunderstood the digital footprint of the woman he had just murdered. The disappearance of an average adult can sometimes go completely unnoticed for days. People get busy. They turn off their phones. They take spontaneous trips. But Shanann Watts was not an average adult. She was the gravitational center of her entire social and professional circle. She was a high-level executive who lived her life connected to her smartphone. She never missed a text message. She never ignored a phone call. She was online, active, and engaged 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, her close friend and colleague, Nicole Atkinson, who had dropped her off just hours earlier, picked up her phone and sent Shanann a simple text message to check in. She wanted to know how Shanann was feeling after the delayed flight. Nicole waited for the familiar notification chime, but the response never came. 1 hour passed. Then 2 hours passed. The digital silence emanating from Shanann's phone was not just unusual, it was entirely unprecedented. It was the equivalent of a loud, blaring alarm bell in an otherwise silent room. But the true catalyst for the incoming panic, the undeniable red flag that proved something was catastrophically wrong, happened later that morning. Shanann was 15 weeks pregnant with her son, Nico. Because she suffered from severe lupus, her pregnancy was considered extremely high risk. She required constant monitoring. That Monday morning, Shanann had a highly important, long-scheduled appointment with her obstetrician. A pregnant mother with a life-threatening autoimmune disease simply does not oversleep and miss a crucial ultrasound to check on the heartbeat of her unborn child. When the doctor's office confirmed that Shanann was a no-show, the first domino officially fell. The cold grip of genuine terror began to tighten around Nicole Atkinson's chest. She began calling mutual friends. No one had heard a single word from Shanann. No one had seen a single post on her Facebook page. And then, a second, even more horrifying realization set in. It was not just Shanann who had vanished into thin air. Bella Marie, who was 4 years old, and Celeste, who was 3 years old, were also completely missing. Anybody who has ever been around a toddler knows that they are inherently loud, demanding, and impossible to ignore. They need breakfast, they need attention, they need their mother. But nobody had heard the girls crying. Nobody had seen them playing in the backyard. The entire Watts family had seemingly evaporated from the face of the earth, leaving behind a dead zone of unanswered calls and growing dread. Nicole could not shake the sickening feeling in the pit of her stomach. The mathematics of this disappearance were completely illogical. Driven by a fierce loyalty to her friend and an overwhelming wave of anxiety, Nicole made a decision that would ultimately shatter Chris Watts's carefully constructed timeline. Around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, she stopped calling and started driving. She headed straight back to the imposing house on Saratoga Trail. When Nicole pulled up to the curb, the house looked deceptively calm in the bright afternoon sun. But as she walked up the concrete path to the front door, the atmosphere felt incredibly wrong. It was too quiet. She pressed the illuminated ring of the doorbell camera. The chime echoed hollowly inside the empty house. There were no footsteps. There was no barking from the family dog, at least not at first. Nicole stepped off the porch and began to circle the perimeter of the large house. She tried to peek through the narrow glass slits next to the heavy front door. Her eyes adjusted to the shadows of the interior hallway, and there, sitting neatly on the floor near the entryway, she saw something that made her blood run absolutely cold. She saw Shanann's favorite pair of shoes. The exact same shoes she knew Shanann wore all the time. A 15-week pregnant woman, suffering from intense joint pain caused by lupus, does not simply walk out of her house barefoot to start a new life. Breathing heavily, Nicole moved toward the large white garage doors. The doors were tightly shut, locked from the inside. She walked up to the small glass windows at the top of the garage doors. She cupped her hands around her face, pressing her forehead against the glass to block out the harsh glare of the Colorado sun. She peered into the gloom of the garage. Her heart dropped into her stomach. Parked perfectly inside the shadows was Shanann's luxury Lexus SUV. It had not moved an inch. Nicole squinted, looking deeper into the vehicle. Strapped securely into the back seats of the Lexus were the two bulky, expensive child car seats belonging to Bella and Celeste. The terrifying pattern was now fully identified, and it was visually undeniable. The story Chris would later try to tell was already falling apart before he even opened his mouth. What mother packs up and runs away from a failing marriage, completely on foot, heavily pregnant, leaving her shoes by the front door, leaving her vital medication behind, and abandoning her only vehicle with the child car seats still firmly attached inside? How could a mother carry a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old for miles without a trace? The answer was brutally simple. She couldn't. And she didn't. Standing in the driveway, Nicole Atkinson realized that her friend was not missing on purpose. She was trapped in a nightmare. Nicole immediately pulled out her cell phone and dialed Christopher Watts. When he finally answered the phone, he was still at the Anadarko oil site, miles away, standing near the very tanks where he had just disposed of his own flesh and blood. Nicole's voice was shaking with panic as she demanded to know where Shanann was. Chris's voice coming through the speaker was flat, robotic, and disturbingly calm. He lacked the frantic, breathless desperation of a husband whose family had just vanished. He told Nicole a flimsy, rehearsed lie. He claimed that he and Shanann had engaged in a deeply emotional conversation early that morning, and that she had taken the girls to a friend's house for a play date. He could not name the friend. He could not explain the car. But then, Chris made his biggest mistake. Hearing the panic in Nicole's voice, he explicitly asked her not to involve the authorities. He told her to calm down, to wait, to let him handle it when he got home from work. He needed time. He desperately needed a few more hours alone in that house to clean up the microscopic evidence, to dispose of the cell phone he had stuffed into the couch cushions, and to finalize his theatrical staging of a runaway wife. But Nicole Atkinson refused to play his game. She completely ignored the requests of the seemingly perfect husband. Standing outside the locked fortress that was hiding a slaughter, she ended the call with Chris Watts, brought her thumb down on her phone screen, and firmly dialed 911. In that single heroic moment of defiance, Nicole Atkinson destroyed the murderer's window of opportunity. The clock was no longer ticking in favor of Chris Watts. The police were officially on their way. And the impenetrable darkness that Chris had created was about to be dragged violently out into the unforgiving light of day. As the investigation progressed into the dark, hidden corners of the Cervi 319 oil field, the reality of the situation shifted from a simple case of a missing person to a scene of unprecedented, clinical brutality. The local authorities, working in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation arrived at the desolate landscape of the oil site. The area was barren, covered in dust, and surrounded by the constant, mechanical, and lonely hum of oil extraction machinery. It was a place where nobody would ever accidentally wander. It was a place designed for total concealment. The ground was baked hard by the intense heat of the Colorado summer, and the air was heavy with the smell of dry earth and stagnant oil. The officers began their systematic search of the ground. They were looking for any sign of freshly disturbed earth, any inconsistency in the topography of the land. It was in the early hours of August 16, 2018, that the investigators found the first, sickening trace of human interference. About 25 yards away from the massive, towering steel oil tanks, hidden in a field of tall, dry, and yellowing grass, they found a shallow, rectangular depression in the ground. It was barely deep enough to be considered a grave. The earth had been hurriedly, clumsily, and poorly piled back over the top, in a pathetic attempt to hide what lay beneath. This was where Shanann Watts had been dumped. The investigators, their hearts heavy with the weight of the nightmare they were uncovering, carefully exhumed the body. The cold, lifeless reality of the discovery hit every single agent on that field with the force of a physical blow. She had been buried there, in the dirt, discarded like an afterthought in the life of the man who had promised to cherish and protect her forever. Every one of those officers had to fight back the overwhelming urge to look away, to turn their backs on the harshness of the evidence they had brought to the surface. But as the investigation deepened, the horror intensified to a level that few human minds are equipped to comprehend. Near the shallow grave of the mother stood the two monstrous, towering steel tanks. They were massive, industrial containers used to store raw crude oil. They were dark, metallic, and forbidding, standing like monolithic sentinels in the middle of the desert landscape. The investigators noticed that the hatch on top of each tank the tiny circular access point, was slightly ajar. These hatches measured exactly 8 inches in diameter. 8 inches. That is a space approximately 20 centimeters wide. It is a tiny, claustrophobic opening, barely large enough for a person to reach through with their hand, let alone for any other purpose. The forensic teams began the gruesome, slow, and meticulously painful process of investigating the interior of those tanks. What they found inside is the detail that changed the history of true crime in the United States. It is a detail that made the lead investigators physically ill. They discovered that the bodies of Bella Marie Watts and Celeste Catherine Watts had been shoved with extreme, violent force through those 8-inch circular hatches. They had been sunk into the toxic, thick, black liquid of the crude oil. The autopsy reports, which were later made public in the official discovery documents, revealed the horrific physical consequences of that act. On the body of the 4-year-old daughter, Bella, the medical examiners found tragic, unmistakable evidence of the struggle that occurred at the edge of the tank. They found strands of her long hair that had been ripped from her scalp, caught in the jagged, sharp edges of the tank's metallic hatch. She had been forced through the hole. Her body had been pushed into the abyss, and in the process, the unforgiving metal had scraped and shredded her skin. There were deep abrasions on her body, consistent with being forced through a space that was fundamentally too small for a human child to pass through without significant physical trauma. The investigators were forced to stand there, under the relentless, unforgiving heat of the Colorado sun, and imagine the final agonizing moments of those 2 little girls. They were forced to consider the sheer level of sociopathic detachment required for a man to look at his own children, the blood of his own blood, and decide that they could be discarded like industrial waste. The crude oil had begun to break down their fragile bodies, a process that made the identification and the retrieval of the remains an absolute nightmare scenario for the forensic divers and the hazmat teams tasked with the recovery. They worked in silence, their faces grim, their movements slow and deliberate, knowing that every movement they made was a part of a record that would ultimately condemn the man who had done this. While this was happening, the collective panic at the headquarters and among the law enforcement teams was reaching a boiling point. The detectives who had spent the last several days listening to the increasingly desperate and increasingly incoherent lies of Chris Watts were now confronted with the absolute physical truth of his barbarity. They realized that they were not dealing with a man who had made a sudden, impulsive mistake. They were dealing with a man who had planned every single second of the annihilation of his family. He had not lost his temper. He had executed a plan. They thought back to the conversation they had held with Chris in the interrogation room. They remembered his face. They remembered the way he had sat there, calmly, almost bored, as if he were discussing the weather, while describing the supposed playdate that never happened. They remembered how he had looked them in the eye and tried to manipulate the narrative, attempting to turn the blame onto Shanann, trying to make the authorities believe that she was the one who had committed the unthinkable. The detectives, hardened by years of dealing with the worst of humanity, were stunned into silence. One of the lead agents on the case would later describe that moment as the most surreal and the most disturbing moment of his entire career. He described the feeling of standing in that oil field, smelling the raw, heavy scent of crude oil mixed with the metallic, iron smell of blood, and knowing that the man responsible was sitting in a holding cell, possibly expecting to be released or to get away with the story he had constructed. The panic was no longer about finding the missing women. It was about reconciling the scale of the evil they were dealing with. The search for Shanann and the children had concluded, but the search for the motive, the search for the understanding of how such a man could exist, had only just begun. The police were now tasked with the heavy burden of documenting every single horrific detail, from the exact location of the hair on the hatch to the specific volume of oil in the tanks. Every single fact was a nail in the coffin of the murderer's future. The investigators knew with absolute certainty that they had the man who committed the crime. The physical evidence from the field, the forensic data from the oil tanks, the location of the grave, all pointed in one singular, undeniable direction. There was no longer any room for doubt. There was no longer any room for alternative theories. Christopher Lee Watts had attempted to erase his family from the face of the earth, and instead, he had only managed to create the most indelible, unforgettable, and damning record of his own monstrous nature. As the sun began to set over the horizon, casting long, deep, and haunting shadows across the desolate oil field, the magnitude of what had transpired truly started to sink in. This was not a domestic dispute. This was not a tragedy born of passion. This was an extermination. It was the deliberate, planned, and calculated removal of 3 people who had loved him, trusted him, and relied on him for their safety. The collective panic of the investigation turned into a cold, hard, and unwavering resolve. They would make sure that this man, this father, this monster, would never see the light of freedom for as long as he lived. They would hold him accountable for every scratch on that metal hatch, for every strand of hair in the crude oil, and for the life of the unborn boy who would never have the chance to be born. The horror of Servi 319 had been exposed, and there was no going back. The evidence was absolute, and the truth had finally triumphed over the web of lies. The investigation had now entered its most critical and treacherous phase. The house on Saratoga Trail had been combed through, but the police were still operating with a significant tactical handicap. They were still treating Chris Watts as a distraught, innocent, and grieving husband rather than the prime suspect in a triple homicide. This was, in hindsight, one of the most significant and perhaps most frustrating tactical errors of the entire case. By allowing Chris to remain free, to walk around the house, to use his phone, and to guide the police through his own crime scene, the officers were unknowingly giving the killer the time and the comfort he desperately needed to rehearse his elaborate lies. They were relying on their training to identify a suspect based on immediate, visceral red flags. But Chris was a master of suppression. He was a man who had conditioned himself to believe his own fiction. However, the tide was about to turn. And it was going to happen not inside the Watts residence, but right next door, in the quiet suburban home of a neighbor named Nate Trenastic. Nate was a man who valued the security of his property and his family. He had installed a state-of-the-art high-definition surveillance system on his property, and one of his best cameras was pointed directly, perfectly, and unblinkingly at the front of the Watts home. As the police officers continued to move through the rooms of the Watts house, they were still grasping at straws. They were looking for a trail, a note, a sign of struggle, anything that would tell them where Shanann and the children had gone. But Chris Watts was still playing his part. He was standing in the living room, hands shoved deep into his pockets, his body language oddly stiff and detached. He was watching the officers, gauging their reactions, subtly trying to steer them away from the garage, away from the evidence that he had carefully left behind. He was a silent actor in his own play. Officer Coonrod and the other responding officers eventually made their way out of the Watts house and walked over to Nate Trenastic's front door. Nate had been watching the scene unfold from his window. He knew something was fundamentally wrong. He knew that the family next door was not the type of family to just disappear. He invited the police into his home, into his living room. This was the absolute, singular, and pivotal moment of the investigation. The room was dark, lit only by the soft, pulsating, and eerie glow of the large television screen where the security footage was playing. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, suffocating, and thick with the weight of impending truth. Nate turned to the police officer and said, quote, "I have it on camera. I have the entire thing recorded. You need to see this." End quote. Chris Watts was present in the room. He was forced to stand there, right behind the police officer, and watch the evidence of his own crimes being played back in real time. He was no longer the master of the narrative. He was a spectator to his own downfall. The screen flickered. The digital timestamp at the bottom of the video read August 13th, 2018. The footage showed the dark street, the quiet neighborhood, and then, at exactly 5:17 in the morning, the image of Chris Watts' white work truck pulling into the frame. The video clearly depicted him backing the vehicle slowly, deliberately, and carefully into his own driveway. He positioned it perfectly, nose in, right in front of the garage door. In the living room, the tension was absolutely unbearable. Officer Coonrod, Nate, and Chris Watts were all staring at the screen. The video continued. It showed Chris getting out of the driver's side door. It showed him walking to the back of the truck. It showed him opening the tailgate. For the next 45 minutes, the surveillance footage captured the dark, shadowy, and distinct silhouette of Chris Watts moving back and forth between his truck and his house. He was seen loading heavy, bulky items into the bed of the truck. One of the items, clearly visible under the bright security light, was a bright red gasoline can. It was a detail so mundane and yet so damning that it stood out like a beacon of guilt. As the video played, Chris Watts' physical reaction was immediate, visceral, and betraying. Standing there in the dark living room, he was caught completely off guard. He had not anticipated that the neighbor's camera would be so clear, so precise, and so damning. His breathing hitched. He began to sway slightly, his center of gravity shifting in a way that screamed desperation. He instinctively reached up and clamped both of his hands firmly on top of his head, a classic, involuntary gesture of a person who has just realized they are trapped. He was essentially witnessing his own funeral in slow motion. The police officers were not stupid. They were watching the footage, and they were watching Chris. They saw the inconsistency. He had told them just hours earlier that he had gone to work that morning like every other morning. He had told them he didn't know anything about why Shanann was gone. And yet, there he was on the screen, in the dead of night, engaging in the exact behavior one would expect from someone who was disposing of heavy, human-sized objects. Chris tried to speak. He tried to offer an explanation. He stammered, his voice cracking, as he pointed at the screen and said, quote, "I don't know why I was doing that. I was just getting ready for work." End quote. But the lie was pathetic. It was transparent. It was a desperate grab at a reality that no longer existed. The police officer looked at Chris, and in that look, the bond of trust, however fragile it had been, was permanently severed. This was a major error in the investigation's initial handling, because for those few minutes, Chris Watts was able to maintain his facade while standing in a room full of people who now knew he was a murderer. The officers should have cuffed him the moment they saw the red gas can. They should have secured him immediately, but instead, they continued to watch. They watched him load the truck. They watched him walk back and forth. They watched him perform the final logistical steps of the annihilation of his own family. As the video reached its conclusion, the silence in Nate's living room was absolute. You could hear the muffled sound of the refrigerator running. You could hear the distant, faint sound of traffic on the main road. But inside that room, the world had stopped. Chris Watts was a man who had thought he was smarter than everyone else. He had thought that by keeping his cool, by staying polite, by being the quiet, unassuming man that everybody knew, he could outsmart the law. But he had forgotten the omnipresence of the modern world. He had forgotten the ring cameras, the dashboard cameras, the neighbors' security systems, the digital footprints, the location services on his phone. He had tried to hide his crimes in a suburban neighborhood that was designed to be watched, monitored, and documented. The police officer finally began to move. He took a step toward Chris. The dynamic of the room had shifted. Chris was no longer the helpful neighbor assisting in a search. He was a suspect who had just been caught lying, and the police, now armed with the visual evidence from the surveillance footage, were beginning to form the questions that would break him down. They were no longer asking about where Shanann was. They were asking, quote, "Why were you backing your truck into your garage at 5:17 in the morning with a gasoline can?" End quote. The error had been made, the time had been lost, but the truth was finally starting to emerge from the darkness. Chris Watts had been caught on camera, and he knew it. And in that moment, as he looked at the police officers standing in the room, he realized that he had no more moves left to make. The walls were closing in, the cameras had betrayed him, and the nightmare that he had created for his family was rapidly becoming his own reality. He was a cornered animal, and the hunt had officially begun. The psychological torture that Chris had inflicted upon his family was about to be reflected back onto him by the machinery of the justice system. He stood in the corner of the dark room, his eyes darting from the screen to the police, his entire persona crumbling into the dust of his own making, while the truth of his monstrous existence stood exposed to the light. The transition from the neighbor's living room to the formal interrogation suite at the local police headquarters felt like stepping into an entirely different, colder world. The room was tiny, windowless, and painted in a sterile, muted color that seemed designed to drain the energy out of anyone who sat inside it. The air conditioning hummed with a low, constant, and irritating vibration that filled the awkward silences. This was where Christopher Lee Watts was meant to crack. He was placed in a hard, uncomfortable metal chair, and the door was closed, locking him inside the box that would soon become the site of his ultimate undoing. The investigators who walked through the door were not there to be his friends. They were Special Agent Graham Coder of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Tammy Lee, a highly skilled agent from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. They had seen countless killers in that room. They knew the language of deception. They knew the micro-expressions of guilt, and they knew exactly how to dismantle a man who was hiding a secret as horrific as the one Chris carried. The interview did not begin with accusations. It began with the pre-test phase of a polygraph examination. Tammy Lee, sitting across from him, explained the process with a level of clinical, detached professionalism that Chris found deeply unsettling. He was not used to being the one under the microscope. He was used to being the one in control, the one who moved through the world with a quiet, polite, and unassuming demeanor that everyone trusted. But in this room, his reputation meant absolutely nothing. The agents were not interested in his story about the playdate. They were not interested in his theories about where his wife had gone. They were interested in the physiological reactions of his body to the truth. As the wires were attached to his chest and his fingertips, Chris felt the reality of his situation beginning to tighten around his throat. The pre-test interview lasted for what felt like an eternity. The agents pressed him on the timeline. They asked him over and over again about the early morning hours of August 13th, 2018. They circled back to the gasoline can. They circled back to the truck. They circled back to the strange, unnatural stillness of the house. Chris tried to maintain his composure. He tried to keep his breathing slow, to keep his voice steady, but the stress of the situation was a physical weight. Every time he lied, he had to work twice as hard to keep the narrative consistent. He had to remember what he told the neighbors, what he told the police in the driveway, and what he told his co-workers. The mental exhaustion was becoming impossible to manage. When the polygraph test was officially administered, the result was catastrophic for his defense. The machine did not lie. It detected the spikes in his heart rate, the changes in his skin conductivity, and the irregular patterns of his respiration when he was asked the critical questions. He failed. He failed with one of the most abysmal scores in the history of the Bureau. When Tammy Lee stepped out of the room to consult with Graham Coder, Chris was left alone with his own thoughts for the first time in hours. The isolation was profound. He looked at the walls, he looked at his own hands, and he realized that the game was over. The physical evidence had been found, the surveillance footage had been analyzed, and now the scientific evidence had confirmed what everyone in the room already suspected. When the agents returned, the atmosphere had shifted. The politeness was gone, replaced by a firm, unwavering demand for the truth. Graham Coder leaned forward in his chair. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to fill the small room. He looked at Chris and said, quote, "I know you're not telling me the whole story, Chris, and the longer you wait, the worse this is going to get for you. We know what happened at the house. We know what happened at the oil site. We need you to tell us why." End quote. Chris began to crumble. He started to stutter. His hands, usually so steady, began to shake. He looked at the floor. He looked at the ceiling. He looked anywhere but at the agents. He began to offer a version of the truth that was a final, desperate attempt to save his own soul. He asked if he could speak to his father, Ronnie. This was the moment. The agents realized he was ready to talk. When his father was brought in, the emotional dynamic in the room changed completely. Chris, reduced to a sobbing, incoherent mess, confessed to his father that he had killed Shanann. But even in his confession, he was a coward. He tried to frame the narrative in a way that shifted the moral weight away from himself. He claimed that he had told Shanann he wanted a divorce, and that in a fit of rage, she had harmed the children. He claimed that he had only killed her because he was reacting to what she had done. It was a sick, twisted, and entirely false story. It was the final, desperate lie of a man who could not bear to accept the reality of his own monstrous actions. The agents listened to him. They let him talk. They let him weave this pathetic web of deceit, all the while knowing that it was entirely fabricated. They knew the autopsy results. They knew the condition of the bodies in the oil tanks. They knew that no mother, regardless of her emotional state, would ever do what Chris claimed she had done. They dismantled his lie, piece by piece, question by question, forcing him to confront the illogical, impossible, and horrific nature of his claims. As the reality of his position set in, Chris realized that even his confession was not enough to save him from the truth. He was backed into a corner. He was a man who had murdered his entire family, his wife, his 2 daughters, and his unborn son. And he was now sitting in a cold metal chair, being forced to explain the unexplainable. The agents watched as the last remnants of his personality dissolved. He wasn't the father of the year anymore. He wasn't the husband of the year. He was just a murderer who had been caught, exposed, and broken by the very system he thought he could outsmart. The process of the confession was agonizingly slow. He would start a sentence, stop, look away, and then struggle to find the words to continue. He spoke about the stress, he spoke about the finances, he spoke about his mistress, and he spoke about the future he thought he was going to have. It was a bizarre, disjointed monologue of a man who was experiencing the total collapse of his own reality. The agents listened with a stony silence, their faces completely unreadable, their pens scratching against the paper as they documented every single word. When the confession was finally over, the silence in the room was heavier than it had ever been. Chris sat back in his chair, his eyes glazed over, his body drained of all its tension. He had done it. He had confessed to the crime that would define him for the rest of his miserable life. He had admitted to the murder of his family, and yet there was no relief. There was no catharsis. There was only the cold, hard, and unforgiving reality of what he had done. He was now officially a prisoner, a labeled criminal, a man who had gone from the comfort of his home to the isolation of a prison cell in the span of less than 48 hours. The agents stood up, their work in that room finished. They had secured the confession they needed. They had the narrative of the crime, even if the narrative was still partially obscured by Chris's lingering, pathetic attempts to defend himself. They walked out of the room, leaving him alone in the dark, where the weight of his actions could finally begin to settle in. The interrogation room was quiet once again, but the air inside was different. It was charged with the finality of the truth. Chris Watts had tried to rewrite history, but history, in the end, had been written by the truth. And the truth, cold and unyielding, was that he was a monster who had destroyed everything he touched, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of his own ruin. The silence that followed the sentencing of Christopher Lee Watts was not a silence of peace. It was a silence of profound, heavy, and irreparable loss. In the years since that fateful November in 2018, the world has attempted to move on, but for the families left behind, the calendar remains frozen in that terrible August. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to the Walpoon Correctional Institution, a maximum security prison in the state of Wisconsin. It is there, in a small, sterile cell, stripped of all the comforts and the suburban life he once took for granted, that he will spend the rest of his natural life. He is a man reduced to a number, a prisoner whose legacy is defined entirely by the 3 words that will always precede his name: child murderer, wife killer. He has written letters from behind bars, some of which have been made public, where he speaks of his religious awakening, of his supposed remorse, and of the demons he claims he was fighting. But these words, coming from a man who shoved his own daughters into crude oil, ring hollow and meaningless to the grieving parents and the millions who followed this case. There is no redemption for an act of this magnitude. There is no prayer, no letter, and no apology that can ever reverse the irreversible. The true weight of this tragedy, however, does not rest on the man in the cell. It rests on the shoulders of the Rzucek family, the parents of Shanann Watts. Frank and Sandy Rzucek have navigated the impossible. They have had to bury their daughter, their 2 granddaughters, and the grandson they never got to meet. They have had to turn their devastating grief into a mission of advocacy, fighting to keep the memory of Shanann alive and ensuring that the public never forgets the names of Bella and Celeste. They have had to witness the way their family name, once synonymous with love and warmth, became tied to a global spectacle of horror. Their pain is the raw, beating heart of this story. Every time a new documentary is released, every time a new podcast dissects the gruesome details, the wounds are reopened. They are the ones who carry the burden of the aftermath, the ones who wake up every single day in a world that is fundamentally colder and emptier because of what happened on Saratoga Trail. We often look for reasons in cases like this. We look for a singular cause, a definitive explanation, a why that can help us sleep better at night. We want to believe that evil is something that exists only in monsters, in people who are obviously, visually, and terrifyingly different from us. We want to believe that there are signs, that there are warnings, that we would have known, that we would have seen it coming. But the case of Chris Watts challenges every single one of those comforting assumptions. He was a neighbor, he was a father, he was an employee. He was a man who seemed to fit perfectly into the fabric of everyday life. He was a ghost in plain sight, and that is what makes this story so uniquely and so terrifyingly dangerous. It is the realization that the most devastating evil can be hiding behind the most mundane mask. It is the realization that the American dream can, in the blink of an eye, become the American nightmare. This case has left an indelible scar on our collective consciousness. It has changed the way we look at our neighbors, the way we perceive the intimacy of family life, and the way we interpret the digital signals of our loved ones. It has forced us to question the limits of what we think we know about the people we share our lives with. It stands as a dark monument to the fragility of human existence and the capacity for total, senseless, and calculated destruction. When you walk through those streets today in the quiet suburbs of Colorado, you cannot help but look at the houses with a different perspective. You look at the windows and you wonder who is watching. You look at the front doors and you wonder what happens when they close. You look at the people you pass on the street and you wonder who they really are when the lights go out. The Saratoga Trail case did not just end in a prison cell in Wisconsin. It expanded into the fears, the doubts, and the insecurities of anyone who has ever trusted a person with their life. As we reach the end of this journey into the darkness, we have to ask ourselves what we have truly learned. We have learned that the truth, no matter how deeply it is buried in the desert, no matter how tightly it is locked behind the iron doors of a tank, will always find a way to the surface. We have learned that the digital age provides no true sanctuary for the guilty, and that our technological footprint is, in the end, the most honest witness to our own actions. We have learned that the people we fear the most are not always the ones lurking in the shadows. Sometimes they are the ones sitting at the dinner table. And most importantly, we have learned that the value of the lives lost is not defined by the tragedy of their end, but by the love and the hope that they brought into the world before the darkness took them. Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico are not just headlines. They are not just files in a cabinet. They are 4 human beings whose stories were cut short by an act of absolute, unadulterated evil. And it is our duty as the ones left behind to ensure that their names are remembered, that their lives are honored, and that the truth of what happened to them remains clear, undiluted, and forever present in our minds. The mask of the perfect father has been burned away. The illusion of the perfect family has been shattered. The truth of Chris Watts stands exposed for all time. He is a cautionary tale written in the darkest ink imaginable. He is a testament to the fact that evil does not have to be complicated, it does not have to be supernatural, and it does not have to be hidden. Sometimes evil is just a man who decides, for his own selfish reasons, that he no longer wants the life he created, And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all. As we close this chapter, we invite you to reflect on what you have heard. The details were difficult, the images were haunting, and the reality of the events was, and remains, completely and utterly devastating. But we must face these truths, no matter how uncomfortable they make us, because it is only by understanding the darkest corners of the human experience that we can hope to value, protect, and cherish the light. If you have stayed with us until this very moment, we thank you for your commitment to the truth and for your respect for the lives of the victims. This channel, Illustrated Evil, exists to ensure that these stories are told with the gravity, the detail, and the artistic integrity that they deserve. We do not look away, and we do not sanitize the horror. We document it, we analyze it, and we bring it into the light of day. If you found value in this deep dive, if you believe that these stories need to be told with this level of precision and detail, we ask you to support our mission. Your engagement is what allows us to keep digging, to keep researching, and to keep bringing you the most thorough and accurate reports on the true crime cases that define our time. Please consider sharing your thoughts with us in the comments below. We want to hear your perspective. What struck you the most about the investigation? What, in your opinion, was the turning point in the case? Your insights matter, and they enrich the conversation that we are building together. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel. By joining our community, you stay connected to our work, receiving the latest in-depth investigations every single week. We are here every Monday, every Tuesday, and every Thursday, bringing you the next chapter in the history of human darkness, told through the unique lens of Illustrated Evil. We appreciate you being here, we appreciate your time, and we thank you for your support. Until the next case, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never forget the reality that hides behind the mask. Thank you for following our channel. Every week, we will bring you the most famous crimes in the world. Like this video, share and follow our channel.